We have started recording. Okay. And we will be waiting 1 more minute for our friends. We might need to resolve issues of connection. All right. So today what we're going to try to understand is the socialization of nature, how nature is in fact socialized, turned into a manifestation of society. And by doing that, what we will be trying to do is understand the foundations of modernity. The real foundations of modernity. This is, and in fact, the foundations of civilization as a whole. It seems like an ambitious project, but we will try to clarify and simplify, not in the sense of being simplistic, but in the sense of trying to understand it fundamentally. In order to do that, we're going to be studying 2 texts today. The first is by Zoen, and the second is by Louis the XIVth. But before that, before we do this, let's try to understand the, where did I go? Oh, sorry, I pushed something, some button, okay. Let's try to understand the foundations of civilization as a whole and, of course, of modernity. Let's take a pre-modern example. And that pre-modern example is something like the Roman Empire. Well, if you think of the Roman Empire, what it did is essentially function on solar energy. And this might seem counterintuitive. Why would the Roman Empire function on something as modern as solar energy? But all we have to do is like take 2 seconds to think about it. Basically, the sun, what it allows is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process necessary for the growth of plants. It's basically synthesizing, turning energy into one of the elements of the nutrition of the plant. So basically the sun is, we know this, is what allows the plants to grow. Well, the plants, what they do is feed both humans and animals. And of course, humans feed on animals. So humans are feeding on plants and animals. Plants and animals are both feeding on basically solar energy. Plants are feeding on the plants, animals are feeding on the plants, and the plants are feeding on, their growth is allowed by the sun. Well, what it means is that men and animals, among the things that they can do, because they have access to some energy, to some excess energy, is use some of this excess of this energy that they get from agriculture to construct certain monuments. Monuments such as Baalbek, monuments such as the Pantheon, monuments such as, I don't know, the fort of Jbel, the fort of Byblos, And this, of course, is taking scrap. This energy, this excess energy is scrapped from agriculture. But what it means is that humans, pre-modern humans, had very strong restrictions in terms of energy. They were, in terms of energy, restricted to what agriculture and indirectly what the sun could give them. What this means, among other things, is that this implied, among other things, limitations on the growth of an empire such as the Roman Empire. There was limitations, strict limitations on how many people could be fed. Of these people that could be fed, how many have to be used for agriculture in order to continue the cycle? Of the people that we don't use for agriculture, how many people do we have to use for armies that could allow us to invade other lands and get more energy? How many people can be used for the building of structures such as Andek? How many people can be used for building of structures such as the columns of Dana, the aqueduct, also here in Hazmi, etc. So this limitations, in fact, this energetic limitation was the characteristic of every pre-modern society. Among the things, of course, it limited was the effect that they could have on the environment. Because they had such limitations of energy, they could not build as much as we are building. Their ability to build was limited. They could not procreate as much as we are procreating. Their ability to grow food was limited. Well, if we take another example, and this example is more modern. The example is a single teaspoon of gas, of car gas. It could be a spoon or a teaspoon. Of this spoon of gas, in terms of energy, it contains something like the equivalent, and this you can read it in the text I'm going to give you. It contains the equivalent of 8 hours of human work. What does this mean? Try to think with me. What it means is that in your car now, you have probably something like 50 liters of gas. Okay, these 50 liters of gas, how much do they cost? They could cost, I don't remember what the 20 liters of gas is today, but let's say they cost something like 60,000 liras. They're gonna cost way more very soon. Okay, good. The 60 liters of gas represent the same amount of energy as 2 years of work by a human being. So, in your car right now, it's filled up. If you have 40 liters of gas, I should have said. In your car right now, if you have 40 liters of gas, you have the equivalent of somebody working for you for 2 years. How much do you have to pay them to work for you for 2 years? How much do you have to feed them? Can you pay them could you convince them to work for you for 2 years for 60,000 Lebanese liras? معاش 60,000. So what does this mean? What it means is that for a Roman citizen, it would have taken 2 years of work for him to produce the same amount of work that your car uses when it burns 60 or 50 or 40, liters of gas. What does that mean? What it means is that we have, in effect, access to work. Our civilization has access to work that the Romans could only dream of. Well, it's true that oil, oil, and it's refined as gas, is itself the result of solar energy. You know how oil is created. It's forests compressed by the earth, turning into old forests, ancient forests, compressed by the earth, and all the algae also, by the way, compressed by the earth, turning into oil. So oil is, in fact, it's an organic material. It's a carbon-based material. It was, at one point, it was life. This oil is, in effect, limited, but it has given us, for a time, we, modern people, have, for a time, the illusion that this easy accessibility of energy has allowed us the illusion that we are living in an energy, almost unlimited energy, world of almost unlimited energy. We are, in fact, liberated. We have been liberated from, or relatively liberated from, the enormous energetic restrictions that all pre-modern civilization had to contend with. This is the main difference between modernity and the ancient worlds. And of course, there are consequences to this. Well, what are these consequences? It's a consequence. In a sense, what it is doing is deregulating our relationship, of course, to the environment. And this deregulation, the results are really too numerous to count. They are, of course, well beyond the limitations of our own little lecture here. But we can, allow ourselves a rapid overview. Well, the availability of energy, among other things, what it allowed us to do is for a demographic explosion. Whereas in the ancient world, you needed between 40 and 60% of the population in order to feed the 100% of the population. Today, about 1 to 2% of the human population can feed all the rest. So in the old world, in the pre-modern civilization, depending on how fertile the land is, you needed between 40 and 60 people to feed all the rest, to feed the 100. Today, you need 1 to 2. How did that happen? Tractors. Tractors are now, among other things, of course, but among other things, tractors are now doing the work. Well, how do tractors work? Based on gas. So what do these, among other agricultural innovation, what does this do? What it does is allow us to feed so many people that yearly we throw something like 25 to 30% of whatever in terms of agriculture we produce. We throw food away. That's how much food we can produce now. Well, what does this mean? Well, among other things that it means is that countries, for instance, such as India, such as Egypt, have had to contend with this demographic explosion. What do we do with this? What can we do? Yeah. In Egypt, for instance, they are building tens of thousands of new schools. That's how much they are building new cities. The same thing, of course, with China. In order, in fact, to attempt to keep up with this demographic explosion. What does this, among other things that this demographic explosion does, is increase the competition for water. These people produce waste. This waste is going into the water, so that increasingly fresh water is becoming rarer and rarer. In Rwanda, for instance, you had a population explosion. In a civilization, in a society where the particular forms of heredity meant that agricultural land was divided into smaller and smaller pieces, making them basically commercially non-viable, leading to enormous tensions between the Hutu and the Tutsi, leading to the well-known genocide that led to something like 500,000 to 8,000 people getting killed. We see this in the Indus Valley, where agriculture is creating a problem of salination, earth salination, making the earth less and less fertile, but used to feed more and more people. And in order to deal with this problem, more and more water has to be used. What we are seeing is what seems to be an apocalyptic vision. We behave as if energy is limitless. None of you today has not thrown a plastic bottle away. And I'm talking about myself, by the way, because the water in Lebanon is, you can't drink it, basically. Not if you don't want to have something called heliobacter. Well, what does this mean? What it means is that something that would have been extremely precious in the pre-modern era, which is the bottle of water, I throw it away without a second thought. That's how strong this illusion is. What does this illusion do? What it does, among other things, is the waste problem that we see in Lebanon today. We don't know where to put our garbage anymore. That's how grave our problem is. Our ancestors did not have this problem. Well, there was less of them, and among other things, they did not have that much garbage. They did not have garbage. Food was fed to the sheep or to the goats. You didn't throw it away. They didn't have plastic bottles to throw away. So their effect on, when we look at the 19th century images of Lebanon, the bucolic images, 19th century bucolic images of Lebanon. Well, it was like that because they did not have oil. They did not have access to energy. So what is this modernity that we are living now? What is its fundamental condition? The fundamental condition of modernity, the most important revolution of modernity, is in fact the energy revolution. It's the use of coal, in England in the 18th century to make a water vapor motor run. It's not the motor vapor itself that was revolutionary. It was the harnessing of this coal energy in order to do work that was the truly revolutionary, the more fundamentally revolutionary element. And so what do we see then? What we see is a characteristic of modernity, availability of energy, leading to a second characteristic, which is what we will describe as uniformization, more particularly standardization of the elements of our civilization. And it's this uniformization, this standardization, that we're going to try to understand. And in order to try to understand it, we're going to compare it to a civilization that was fundamentally different from it. And in order to do this, we're going to try to compare two texts. And both texts are about how to basically make a garden. Landscape design. The first text is a Japanese text, a pre-modern Japanese text. The second text was written during the period of what's called royal absolutism. Royal absolutism that was in France, with the great one of the great founders of this royal absolutism, a gentleman by the name of Louis the XIVth, Louis XIVth, the Sun King. The Japanese text is attributed to a priest by the name of Zoen. We know almost nothing of Zoen. What we know is that the manuscript that he wrote contains two dates between one, the equivalent of 1448 and 1466. Which leads us to believe that this text was written somewhere after 1466, so in the era that's called the Muromachi era of Japan, and what's called the landscape gardens, the Zen landscape gardens. The text is entitled, I'll translate directly from French, Illustration pour la conception de paysages de montagne, d'eau et de collines. Illustration for the conception of landscapes of mountains, waters, and hills. Notice that they are viewing the garden as basically a painting, and this is completely understandable in that the origins of Japanese paintings are, in fact, in paintings. We see, by the way, something very similar with the British gardens, with English gardens. The interest of this book is not that it contains a complete and total explanation of Japanese gardens. It doesn't. It's not that it allows us to understand the symbolic element of these gardens. It doesn't. Yeah, it does, but in a very limited way. In reality, the distance between theory and what is written, what is done, what is the actual practice is quite vast. It's quite big. And the symbolism attributed to trees, the symbolism attributed to stones, the symbolism attributed to plants, that that could change. That's not the issue here. Rather, what we are thinking, what we are trying to understand in this text are its presuppositions. What did this author believe was true in order to write this text the way that he wrote it? What are, in fact, the beliefs that structure his text? It's these beliefs that we're going to try to understand. So I'm going to show you two gardens. One is a garden from the period of Muromachi, and the other is a garden from the Garden of Versailles, which leads us to the second text that we're going to try to understand. Again, attempting to understand its basic presuppositions. And the second text was written by Louis the XIVth. Of course, you know who he is. It's his son, so-called Sun King. And the text was written by the king himself, by the way. And it's entitled Manière de montrer les jardins de Versailles. Ways of showing the gardens of Versailles. The text itself, there are 6 different versions written of it by the king himself between 1688 and 1705, sorry. Louis the XIV was a perfectionist. You might describe him as OCD if you like. And there are small variations between one and the other of these texts. He probably, obsessed over some small detail here and there, changing small details here and there. And well, all of them, I mean, very, very small variation, but all of them, what they describe is the itinerary that a visitor must take when visiting the gardens of Versailles. So let's start with Zoen, whose text is older. And the text of Zoen starts with a warning. And this is what the warning says. If you have not received the oral transmission, you must not make gardens. A very strange warning to our modern ears. And this warning is multiplied throughout the text. On every important point of the text, he repeats this idea, almost obsessively. On passage 28, there are oral transmissions. Passage 32, there must be oral transmissions concerning this. They are more important than what I said here. Passage 34. You must inquire thoroughly into oral transmissions on such matter. Passage 35. There ought to be some oral transmissions on this matter. For us, it's very weird. It seems to say the oral transmission is more important than the written, and this is precisely what it says. In that, gardens within Japanese society are the work of masters operating outside of the written tradition, outside of visual illustrations. They are, in fact, transmitted orally. And for us, people who are, in fact, living in a scriptocentric universe, in a universe where the written word is considered to be the most important. Orality is considered to be something transitory, something, that changes too much, that, it's false, by the way. We view the written word as being much more important than oral transmission. Well, this insistence on orality has profound consequences. First off, in Japanese society, oral transmission has a level of legitimacy that it does not have in our own modern society. And the resistance of Zoen to his own text, by the way, this is his own text, but he's resisting its written nature. He's insisting on the limitations of its written nature. Is, in fact, because of this great prestige, because of the great legitimacy given to oral transmission in Japanese culture. Well, we might think of this as being something disadvantageous. There is, in fact, frequently the false illusion that orality is not stable. Today, historians, anthropologists, sociologists are understanding the extraordinary and counterintuitive stability of orality. There are stories today that you know of. Among them, for instance, Chaperon Rouge, the Red Riding Hood, and other stories like it. Some of these stories, using artificial intelligence, computer modeling, they were able to project their origins to 7,000 years. That's how stable oral traditions are. There is, in fact, another advantage to orality, besides its, in that orality has a level of acceptable imperfection. What this means, this acceptable imperfection, is in the passage from the master to the student. This level of imperfection is the student's space of liberty. This is where the student can change and adapt, all the while claiming to be in continuity with this tradition. This imperfection is the very thing that allows orality to adapt to changing circumstances. And so that precisely because this transmission is relatively inefficient, it is able to change and adapt organically. And it's in the space that innovations are and refinements are, in fact, produced. Another element that explains the need for this imperfect transmission, the need for orality. It's that Japanese gardens, or the Japanese gardener, who are great artists, by the way, of the period of the web, had to work with non-uniform elements, non-standardized elements. They were working with particular terrains. And if you look around you, there's not a single terrain on Earth that's different, that's completely similar to the other. But this particularity was something to be valued. They had to protect, the Japanese gardener had to protect the particularity and of the terrain he was working on. He had to protect it and re-express it. The elements that he was using, Japanese gardener, the element that we used, like rocks, for instance. The elements that he was using, he could not modify them. And I'm going to show you what we mean by he could not modify them. The trees he was using had to be modified in a very minimal, almost invisible manner, respecting, in fact, re-expressing their original form. So there were strict limits on the changes that a Japanese gardener could allow himself to bring into nature. And I want you to look at this extraordinarily beautiful thing. What you see here is, in fact, a man-made landscape. This is man-made, but the objective of the artist is for it to appear completely natural. So that when he was talking, for instance, on the representation of valleys, of rivers, you should simply make the stream valley ever so gently rolling and utterly ordinary. The aesthetic that they were describing is the aesthetic of the ordinary. We're going to try to understand this aesthetic. What this means is that you should never attempt to do something that nature is incapable of doing. And written the transmission in its too perfect transmission is resistant to modification. If somebody shows you a tree, a drawing of a tree and tells you that this is how the tree should look like. What he is doing is, in fact, limiting your ability to attempt to work with trees, to attempt to adapt your work to the existent tree. Written transmissions are too perfect. They are resistant to modification. They can, in fact, impose too rigid an order. And this rigid order is not, in fact, adapted to the infinite variabilities, infinite varieties of a non-uniform nature. If you look at nature, there's not a single tree that looks like the other. There's not a single rock that looks like the other. If you attempt a too rigid transmission, a too rigid model of the garden, well, what you would be forced to do is, in fact, modify this variety, standardize this variety, uniform it. Well, these elements are frequently associated to vague symbolism. There is this productive tension between the symbolism, which is unified, more in a vague manner, by the way, and the variability of the elements at the base of the garden. So that, in effect, the Japanese gardener is trying to express unified ideas, and we're gonna see these ideas in a while, using, in effect, variable elements. This demands vagueness. The more precise something is, the less you have elements that are applicable to it. The more vague something is, the more you can, in fact, use it to describe a variety of elements. So the vagueness of the ideas in Japanese symbolism is well adapted to the variety of nature. On the other hand, I should have added an accent ici. I was using copy paste on the accents because I was using one that did not happen. Anyway, the Japanese garden, whereas the Japanese garden works, is what is given. A site whose particularity is respected, rocks that are not modified, landscape architecture of Louis the XIVth, including André Lenotre, one of the heads of these of this architect. What they do is impose to nature geometric forms. Impose to nature what it could not do. This image of Versailles, for instance, is an illustration. We see the vegetation upon which spiral shapes are imposed the relationship of these elements are, in fact, in Gestalt, in form, simple geometric shapes that obey architectural plans, architectural outlines. What we see here is the reduction of nature to the tendency of humans to reduce everything to simple geometry, what we call Gestalt, the Gestalt theory. And this starts, in fact, with Brunelleschi. What we see, in fact, is the enormous power of architectural plans and architectural illustration as an instrument of control. Brunelleschi used the architectural plan as a means of, in fact, imposing control over the artisans. But the plan, the map, the architectural map, with the rise of the absolutist state, becomes an instrument of control of the state over its territories. This uniformization, in fact, of the description of reality, of visual reality, starts with the discovery of what we call linear perspective. And of course, you know what linear perspective is. Linear perspective, the discovery of Filippo Brunelleschi, contributes to the control of the absolute state over its territory and over its population. What do we mean? Well, in the case of Versailles, the evolution of architectural planning towards landscape design, towards drawing nature, and drawing nature as we want it to be, and imposing upon nature the shape that we gave it. What it implies is that there is a necessity of simplifying nature. Well, paradoxically, the simplification of nature requires enormous energetic outlay. In order to simplify nature, you need enormous energy. What do you mean by that? Well, the estimates on the costs of the Palace of Versailles, they vary. Some say something like 25% of the global budget of the French monarchy. We don't know really. But what we know is that it is enormous. There are reports, in fact, that this project almost led France towards bankruptcy. When we talk about money, what are we talking about? Well, when you talk about money, all you are talking about is a symbol, a piece of paper that symbolizes something. Now, what does it symbolize? Ultimately, every piece of paper you call money, what it symbolizes is energy. I'll explain it to you. You spend 2,000 liras, 2,000 something, $2 on a kilo of some fruits. What are you buying? Yes, you are buying the fruit, but for the fruit to get to you, it had to be taken in a lorry. It had to be taken in a truck. The truck costs energy. The truck itself is made of steel. The steel itself, extraction of the steel costs energy. The working of the steel was done by workers. You had to feed them. That costs energy. The agriculture, the agricultural space, that costs energy because, you know, he has to use tractors, he has to use chemicals, he has to, all of this is energy. So what are you doing in effect? You are in fact symbolizing energy using that thing that you call money. In the case of the French society of the 17th and the 18th century, a pre-modern society, that energy still is, in fact, processed through agriculture. The sun energy is still processed through agriculture. But this agricultural limitation, this pre-modern limitation, should not, in fact, hide the modernity of the project of Louis the XIVth. The project of Louis the XIVth is an announcement of our own late modern civilization. It bases itself on a uniformization of natural elements, and it allows our own process of standardization, and our own processes of industrialization, from which very few architects and landscape designers can escape today. And I'll explain it in a while. Yes, Lodi. Lodi, you raised your hand.
Yes, I'm sorry. بس في ناس ما قدروا يفوتوا لأنه الصف عندهم أصلا منه موجود، مشان هيك ما قدروا يفوتوا.
Okay, it's very easy. I'm gonna fix it. Did they place their names on the
They talk
on
to you
WhatsApp?
on in the group.
Yeah.
Yes.
Did they place their emails on WhatsApp? Let them do
I'm
that.
gonna check.
Okay, let's take a 10-minute break, and I will fix this problem. And after the 10-minute break, we're gonna see how, in fact, Louis the XIVth announces our own modernity. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah, well, Let's see, let's share this one. There we go. So, as we were saying, is that money is in fact a symbol of energy, basically, fundamentally. A very simple example, for instance, how much, why is gold expensive? Among other things, there are, of course, inter-individual conditions that lead to being expensive. And among other things is that for every gram of gold, you might need to take out something like 3 tons of earth. So you understand why and how much energy that takes to do. Well, the control over reality through standardized descriptions announced by a process such as perspective, linear perspective, with its manifestation, other manifestation in architecture, in, for instance, what's called the plan horizontal, the horizontal plan, the use of a point of view from above in order to describe reality, but in a geometric standardized manner. All of these elements are ways that architects have taken control over the process of construction, but also eventually through cartography, through the production of maps, which are also standardized ways of describing reality. It has allowed for the state to gain greater control over its own territory. Well, why is this process of uniformization such a fundamental element of modernity? I'll give you one example. An example is very simple. Imagine a, I don't know, imagine a piece or a screw. And imagine the screw is done in Japan. The screw is done in Japan is gonna be able to enter into a piece done in China, or a piece done in France, or a piece done why? Because the processes of standardization have been globalized. We now all use these processes of standardization using the same, in fact, except for Americans with their own systems of measurements. In fact, this is a manifestation. This started to manifest with people like Louis the XIVth. And the royal absolutism, which was its basic ambition, which is centralization. Centralization of power in Versailles over the whole French kingdom. And the fact that standardization, what it did was allowed for greater control. For instance, Louis the XIVth was among the first, if not the first in Europe, trying to remember, who who standardized the uniforms of his army, standardized their weaponry. But he also attempted to standardize taxation. He attempted to standardize things such as theater, based on Aristotle's Poetics. He attempted to standardize things such as painting, using something that is called the Academy. He attempted to, all of these elements, in fact, his attempt at standardization is enormously far-reaching for that period. In fact, in an announcement of modernity. Well, what do we mean by that? I mean, I know that the chair I am sitting on, I can tell you that the chair that you're sitting on is, if I'm not mistaken, something like 42 centimeters high. The table that you have your computer on, if I'm not mistaken, Kaman, is something like 72 centimeters high. The ceiling is probably something like 2 meters 40. All of these elements are completely standardized everywhere. Where did that come from? Well, it came from, among other people, but I mean, enormous contribution by Louis the XIVth, and manifested in the garden of Versailles. I mean, Louis the XIVth did not have tractors. That's true, but he had the equivalent, precise equivalent of tractors, and that is in terms of energy, of course, and that is the thousands of workers. Today we know a tractor can replace the work of hundreds, but he had these hundreds. So instead of the oil, the gas in the tank of the tractor, he had the food that he gave his workers. He used them for the same purpose. Among other things that he used them for instance, was a uniformization, a standardization of the whole forest that was Versailles. Versailles was a forest, he standardized it, he uniformed it. The same as an architect would do today using his tractor. He would come, see his site, and standardize it. He's subtle. He had that. In that sense, he was modern. In that sense that he was using the same process, his excess of energy, to impose uniformity. We use our excess of energy, which is our excess of oil, in order to impose uniformity upon that whole region, 100 square kilometers, that we call Beirut, called the Great Beirut. So this desire for absolute control over the site, over the trees made to look like geometric shapes, as we see here. Over the uniformity, you understand, you see the uniformity. Look at these trees. They are as precisely uniform as you can make them without, modern equipment. All of this seems to be missing from the work of Zoen. Zoen says something absolutely remarkable on the practices of Japanese gardening. This is what he says. And this is, by the way, if you look at it, if you pass by it, would you recognize this as man-made? This is man-made. This is Japanese garden, temple Saihoji of the 14th century. It's man-made. But it's man-made to look like it's not. And this is what he says. This is absolutely fascinating. There is an instruction. It's an oral instruction, by the way. It's implied in the text. That says, you are not to change the position of a rock from which it was in the mountain. Placing a rock so that the part which was underneath in the mountain is on top is called reversing the rock and is to be avoided. To do this would anger the spirit of the rock and would bring bad luck. What does this mean? You took a rock from you saw a rock. You wanted to use it in your garden. You don't have to. You take it from its place. You don't have the right to reverse it. You have to put it back exactly the way it was. Otherwise, you would be angering the spirit. And we're talking here about a particular form of the oldest form of Japanese religiosity. So there is, in fact, a continuity between the source of the rock and its new emplacement. What it means is that symbolically, the rock should not be separate from its origins. In fact, the search for the rock, its displacement, its reinstallation, and its contemplation all are part of the same process. And this process is both symbolic and ritual. There is a ritual for looking for rocks. There is a ritual for, it's the same continuity, ritual continuity. What this ritual continuity does is refuse the separation between the rock and its natural origins. Maintain symbolically the link of the rock to its symbolic origins. This is exactly the opposite of what you see in Versailles Garden and in Versailles Garden. In Versailles Garden, a rock is completely detached from its origin. It's made into a square, into a cube. Its origin it's not even something that you would, something that Louis XIVth would consider. The same thing with the tree. The tree is, in fact, to obey man-made shapes. Its original shape is irrelevant. It's not even thought of. It's just seen as an annoyance, as an obstacle that must be overcome. Look at this in Zoen. This is again in Zoen's text. In the planting of trees and herbs, you make their natural habitat your model. You will not go astray so long as you bear in mind, so long as you bear in mind the principle of planting trees from deep mountains in the deep mountains of the garden. Remember, this is a representation of nature, the garden, with trees, valleys, streams. So you take a tree, you took a tree from the deep mountain, you plant it in the deep mountain of your garden. Trees from hills and fields in the hills and fields of your gardens, herbs and trees from freshwater shore on freshwater shores, and herbs from the seashores, etc. And this is important, for the landscape garden mirrors nature. You are creating a picture of nature. And thus it is said, and that in each and all we must return to the two words, which are, in fact, natural habitat. Think of that. In that sense, Japanese gardens are like echoes, counterpoints to nature. Similar motifs that are repeated but displaced spatially and temporally in order to create what we might describe as a polyphony, a symbolic polyphony. And this polyphony, this similar things echoing each other at different times, implies also the social. Because the garden is not only an expression of a view of nature, it's also a description of social relationships. And these social relationships are themselves a reflection of nature. So what we see is, in fact, the garden is the link between the social and the natural. And this is what he says, to illustrate this. This is what he says on the disposition of the rocks that he calls the rock of respect and affection. The respect and affection stones are two stones set slightly apart with their brows inclined towards one another. So what are we using? We are using natural elements, rocks in this case, to represent human relationships. This is what we might call as an anthropomorphization of nature, which are expressions of nature. The rocks are still express their natural origins, but also expressions of human relationships, harmonious human relationships. And this aesthetic of the garden is framed by social relationships. And if it's framed by social relationships, it must also, in effect, express a respect for hierarchy. And remember, and this is Japanese society is very traditional in terms of hierarchy. This is what he says. Do not position a rock in such a way that it has a sharp point sticking out in the direction of the position from which the master customarily faces the garden, no matter how fascinating the scenic effect. To do that would be impolite. So the aesthetic, in fact, it's like today, it's like in our own culture, to place your foot on a table in front of somebody is considered completely impolite for us. What do I say? So no matter how fascinating, no matter how aesthetic it is, it's impolite and it should not be done. So what does this tell us? What it tells us that aesthetic is, in fact, in an ancillary, is a hierarchically lower position than ethics, because politeness is, in fact, a form of ethics. So, in a sense, the garden must demonstrate in an almost animistic sense, religiously animistic sense, a respect for the hierarchical relationship of the society, of the Japanese society. Meaning, of course, and we've already stated it, aesthetic being in a lower position than ethics. This is completely the opposite of, anyway. On the other hand, whereas Zoen places the garden in a symbolic relationship with its origin, in Versailles, what you see is a radical break with the natural origins of all the materials. All the origin of the materials are completely hidden. They're completely, made meaningless. In reality, this break is the result of a very strong stratification, hierarchical stratification, and the break between hierarchical links. An aristocrat did not work. An aristocrat, to work for him would have been a dishonor. There were other people who worked, and he could allow himself to, at least symbolically, completely ignore whatever that is they're doing, as long as the end result was in concordance with his planning. And this is a kind of break with nature that we see in our own modernity. None of us know where the wood of the table that you are sitting on right now comes from. Neither me nor you. So the text of Louis the XIVth, in fact, concentrates itself on a single aspect of the experience, whereas Zoen concentrates on looking for the stone, on transporting the stone, on the way the stone, no. Louis the XIVth concentrates on a single experience, and that of an impersonally directed visit to the Garden of Versailles. And the text is very, very impersonal. In the directive of Louis the XIVth. It doesn't come out very strongly in English, but in French, there is a way of expressing impersonality, and it's by the use of the word of the article en, we, but we, doesn't really express it. But I'll try to express this in English. En sortant du château par le vestibule de la cour de marbre, on ira sur la terrasse. While leaving the castle, we will go to the terrace, or they, or the thing that are walking, which is humans that are walking, will go to the terrace. Reminds me of Silence of the Lambs. Forget. We must, or it, or the thing, the humans must stop on the up of the stairs, on the top of the stairs, and consider the situation of the water, of the fountains, and the cabinets. It's not only directing what they should do physically, he's also directing how they should act mentally, what they should do mentally to consider the situation. You should now sit on top of these stairs and consider the situation. This is how obsessive this control this text is. Il faut ensuite aller droit sur le haut de la tonne et faire une pause pour considérer la tonne des arbres. So we should go somewhere and do this. Stop and consider les rampes, les statues, l'allée royale, l'Apollon, le canal, puis se tourner pour voir. He is in fact controlling every gesture of the visit. And in fact, you might think that this is an exception. No, no, no. The court of Louis the XIVth was in fact obsessive about things such as sanctuary laws. You were what you could wear with relation to your hierarchy, hierarchical position. What you could not wear was determined by law. How you should act, how you should not act within Versailles was determined by very, very strict protocol, etc. There are orders here. These are given impersonally. And we don't know to whom they are given. In effect, they are given to everybody. These orders, what they do is not simply unify the visit. What they unify is the visitor. All the visitors are considered to be the same. In reality, what we see here is another aspect of modernity, which is reproducibility. Inasmuch as the visit of X to Versailles is the same as the visit of Y to Versailles, is of the same nature of your iPhone being the same as the iPhone of your neighbor. This same desire for uniformity that we see everywhere in the work of Louis the XIVth, the most famous OCD on the planet. It's beyond any subjectivity. The visitors are not allowed subjectivity. Their thinking is controlled. It's beyond any particularity of these visitors. All are treated the same. And the only real voice that we see here is this impersonal voice, which is the voice of the king. And this impersonality, in effect, what it signifies is objectivity. The impersonality of the king is the objectivity of his power, of his legitimacy. He, objectively, must be king. As if 1 and 1 is 2, Louis the XIVth is king. And this objectivity of his power is expressed in this impersonality. So that, in effect, the Garden of Versailles, in its refusal to symbolize its origins, in its refusal to indicate the process of its construction, and by extension, the people who constructed it, we don't know. We don't know who the laborers were. We might know. Some specialists might know. But it's not important. They were not considered to be important by the country. The garden then is considered the expression of is then the expression of very stratified and very disconnected social relationships. This is the same for the narration. The visit to Versailles is a narrative imposed by the king. All you do is play your role within this narrative. There must be a little, to minimize slightly the point. Is that we should distinguish between absolute power and the rhetoric of absolutism. There were, of course, great limitations to the power of Louis the XIVth. We know that. And in fact, far greater limitations to his power than to any modern government. But what we're seeing here is rhetoric. What we're seeing here is, in fact, Louis the XIVth attempting through the rhetoric of this garden to represent his power. And in fact, it's precisely the limitations, the real limitations of Louis the XIVth's power that explain the need for such a garden, the need to convince people using these gigantic economic expenditures. Why did he need to convince people of his power so much? If he had it, if he really had it. The representation of power through rhetoric, through architectural rhetoric and landscape rhetoric, as we see here, is another means of imposing it. If you convince people that you have power, you do have power. Very simple. And this is the plan of Versailles, and you see its enormous architectural, it's completely architectural in nature. In reality, Versailles is much closer to the way we do things. Like Versailles, your house is overwhelmingly indifferent to the origins of its materials. Like your house, the one you're sitting on right now, is the result of an extreme modification of the terrain, a standardization of the terrain. And the standardization of the terrain that we see all over Beirut, all over Paris, is made possible by the availability of energy, tractors, workers, etc. And like your house, Versailles is the result of pre-planning that determines everything. And this pre-planning is an expression of the power of the architect, and through the architect, the power of the king. This pre-planning, which is made possible by the use of architecture, by the use of the architectural plans, and by the use of maps. So with the coming of petrol, with the coming of gas, and the work that it allows, what we see is a democratization of something that was originally the monopoly of people such as Louis the XIVth. What we see is that the practices of construction of Louis the XIVth now apply to everyone, have been democratized. So that the ability of the King of France to use thousands of workers, completely convinced of the legitimacy of his authority, today is replaced by instruments of construction, modern instruments of construction, like tractors, for instance, that are as brutal, able to be as brutal as what these thousands of workers could do, but they are much more available, much cheaper. On the other hand, Zoen seems to represent something else. It seems to represent another way of doing things. Perhaps a way of addressing the problems of the environmental problems of modernity, perhaps. This is Katsura. It's probably one of the 2 or 3 most beautiful gardens ever created. I think you would agree with me now from this small image that we see here. And by the way, the visit to Katsura is extremely limited, so don't, unless you did, if you know the emperor. Anyway. There is an effect in Katsura and in other Japanese gardens in aesthetic superiority over the formalism of the French Renaissance French gardens. I will allow myself this subjective opinion. Why? Because they are able, in fact, to account for the far greater complexity of nature. The French garden, what it does is take the enormous complexity of nature. And we know the geometric complexity of nature is amazing. You take a tree, any tree, its geometry is amazing. You might, in your mind, simplify it to a sphere. In reality, every leaf of this tree is organized in such a way to get the maximum amount of sunlight. That's how a human architect would be unable to do that. Japanese landscape design take this complexity and absorbs it into its work. Whereas the French and Renaissance garden tries to limit it, tries to reduce it. So that in effect what we see is a far greater visual sophistication in the Japanese garden. But beyond that, there are elements, ideas in the way that are very strangely adaptable to a modern environmental approach. A consciousness of the origins of materials. And the environmentalists have been screaming for the longest time that we should, in effect, become conscious of where our materials come from, to, as much as possible, use the closest material possible. So consciousness of material, the origins. The use of trees in places that corresponds to their sites, to their original sites of origins. And we see an extension of this today in, for instance, the resistance of the Australians to import foreign trees into Australia. Their obsessive resistance to importing strange animals, by the way, manifest also. we did not see this in Beirut, for instance. In Beirut, if you look at it, you're surrounded by ficus. Ficus is this kind of particular kind of ficus that does not come from Lebanon. Today, all of the environmentalists tell you, okay, if you want to replant somewhere like Jej, for instance, the beautiful village of Jej, you have to use local vegetation. So a relationship between where you take the tree and where you put it. And an approach that attempts to limit itself in the ordinary, the aesthetic of the ordinary that we talked about above. An aesthetic of the ordinary that is completely opposed to this idea of conspicuous consumption, which is precisely the idea that you see in Versailles. An aesthetic that is in fact contained by ethic. An aesthetic that is contained by ethics and that is contained by is proto-environmentalist ethics. That we are in fact limited in our behavior as artists. We must not attempt to dominate nature. What we need to do is in fact to reproduce nature and link it to harmonious social relationship without destroying it. The fundamental idea of Zoen is, in fact, I will not hesitate to use the word, his genius, is this idea of never produce anything that nature is incapable of doing. In that sense, he represents an alternative to the uniforming modernity that Louis XIVth represents. Any questions? None?
No, ما في أي سؤال.
All right. Thank you very much for your attention. And as we have stated, sorry, yes. Somebody's trying to speak. Vivian, I think. That's Vivian.
No, not me.
Okay. All right. So we will, like we said, for the methodology course, it's now on Wednesday at 6:30. All right. Thank you all. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Doctor.
Can I ask you a question?
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Question.
Yes.
اوكي ما بعرف بس السؤال انا عندي انترنت محلات I couldn't attend class so is it possible to put recorded session?
Of course, I will put the recording in two places, and one is more or less I'll upload it to YouTube, and the other I'll upload it to YouTube. It's the easiest way.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all.
مسيو حاج عندي سؤال.
Yes, somebody has.
من فضلك إذا بدنا نرجع نسمع يلي شرحته هلا وبدنا
I'll
نقرا.
send you the link, yes. And I'll send you my article as well. This is a published article.
Yes, thanks.
All right.